For 9 years, an elderly woman stood on a Chicago street corner selling homemade bread, every loaf to feed her orphaned grandson. She had no legal custody, no safety net, nothing but flour and prayer. Then one morning, a federal judge's motorcade stopped at her corner. The man who stepped out wasn't there for the bread. He was there for the boy. What happened next changed everything and exposed a system that had failed them both. Her name was Ida Mee Collins. She was 71 years old. And for nearly a decade, she had been raising her grandson in the shadows of a legal system that didn't even know they existed. No birth certificate linking them, no custody papers, no government assistance, just a folding table, a bread recipe passed down from her own grandmother, and a 9-year-old boy whose entire world was a street corner. She was invisible, but that morning, invisibility was no longer an option. Ida Mee Collins had been invisible for 9 years. Every morning at 5 a.m., she mixed dough with hands cracked from cold and age. By 6, she was on the corner of 63rd and Cottage Grove, a folding table displaying loaves wrapped in wax paper, a handwritten sign that read "Homemade bread $5." Beside her, a little boy in a too-large coat did his homework on a milk crate. That boy was her grandson, Marcus. He was 9 years old, and he had never known another home. Marcus came to Ida Mee when he was 6 weeks old. His mother, Ida Mee's daughter, had vanished into a world of addiction and vanished again into the justice system. His father was a name on a birth certificate, no address, no visits, no child support. Ida Mee didn't hesitate. She took that baby into her one-bedroom apartment and built a life around him. She had no legal guardianship, no court order, no official standing. In the eyes of the state, she was nothing more than a concerned stranger who happened to share blood. And that distinction, that legal invisibility, nearly destroyed them. Without legal custody, Ida Mee couldn't enroll Marcus in school properly. She couldn't access food stamps for him, couldn't get Medicaid beyond emergency coverage, couldn't sign medical forms at the clinic. Every basic right most parents take for granted required a court order she could not afford to pursue. The average cost of a contested guardianship case in Chicago runs between $4,000 and $10,000. Ida Mee earned about $800 a month selling bread. After rent, utilities, and the little she could afford to feed them both, there was nothing left for lawyers. So she did what grandmothers in her community have done for generations. She survived in the gaps between the law and the street. She learned which school secretary would look the other way when she registered Marcus using an informal kinship care affidavit. She found a pediatrician at a free clinic who would see the boy without asking too many questions. She built a network of neighbors who watched Marcus when she went to buy flour and sugar, a mutual aid system born of shared struggle. But the constant fear never left her. Every police cruiser that slowed near her corner, every visit from a social worker following up on an anonymous tip, every bureaucratic form that demanded a signature she didn't have the legal authority to give. She lived in terror that one day the state would decide Marcus belonged in foster care, that her lack of a stamp and a notary seal would tear her grandson from her arms. But here's the thing about Ida Mee Collins. She had something the system could not measure. Her grandmother had been enslaved in Mississippi and had learned to bake bread in a sharecropper's kitchen. That recipe, passed down through 4 generations of black women, was not just sustenance, it was inheritance. Every loaf Ida Mee sold carried 150 years of survival, and that bread kept their bodies alive while she fought to keep their family intact. Marcus grew. He was bright, curious, reading at a 5th grade level by 2nd grade despite the chaos of his home life. He knew every regular customer by name. He knew how to count change, how to wrap the loaves, how to smile when he was tired and hungry, how to hide his fear when police cars cruised past. He had learned to be invisible too. Then came the morning of October 14th. The sky was steel gray, the air biting cold. Ida Mee was setting up her table as usual when the motorcade appeared. 2 black SUVs, a sedan with government plates, and the unmistakable silhouette of a United States Marshal's escort. The little corner fell silent. Ida Mee pulled Marcus close, and then the back door of the sedan opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, dignified, wearing a dark suit and the kind of polished shoes that never touched a sidewalk like this one. His name was Judge Reginald Harlan, Federal District Court Judge for the Northern District of Illinois, 20 years on the bench, and he was walking straight toward the bread table. Ida Mee's heart pounded. She had seen enough of the world to know that powerful men in suits rarely stopped for people like her unless trouble was coming. Judge Harlan looked at the table, looked at the boy, looked at the woman's worn hands. He nodded to his security detail to stand back. Then he asked a question that cracked Ida Mee's world wide open. It was not about the bread, it was about the boy, and what the judge did next would force him to confront the limits of his own power. Judge Reginald Harlan did not ask about the bread. He asked, "Ma'am, is this your grandson?" Ida Mee's grip tightened on Marcus's shoulder. She had rehearsed this moment in her head 1,000 times, the moment when someone with authority finally stopped and asked the question that could unravel everything. She had practiced different answers, lies, half-truths, deflections, but standing there in the cold October morning with a federal judge's eyes on her, she found she couldn't lie, not anymore. "Yes," she said quietly, "he's my grandson. I've been raising him since he was a baby." Judge Harlan looked at Marcus, who was staring at the motorcade with the wide-eyed wonder of a child who had never seen power up close. Then he looked at the folding table, the loaves wrapped in wax paper, the milk crate with the boys' schoolbooks, the woman's cracked hands. He had presided over family court cases for years before his federal appointment. He knew what he was looking at: a kinship care arrangement with no legal status, a grandmother living on the edge of catastrophe. A child one bureaucratic decision away from foster care, and he knew the law well enough to know that the law was not designed to help people like Ida Mee Collins. "My name is Reginald Harlan," he said. "I'm a federal judge. I'm not here to cause you trouble. I saw this boy doing schoolwork on a milk crate as we drove past, and something told me to stop. I've learned to listen to that voice." He paused. "How long have you been doing this?" 9 years, Ida Mee said. 9 years on this corner, every day except Sundays, and sometimes Sundays too when the rent was due." The judge nodded slowly. He asked where Marcus went to school. Ida Mee hesitated, then told him the name of the elementary school 4 blocks away. She didn't tell him that Marcus was enrolled under an informal arrangement that could collapse at any moment. She didn't tell him about the sympathetic secretary who had bent the rules. But judges are trained to hear what isn't being said. Judge Harlan heard the gaps in her story, the careful omissions, the fear behind every word. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "If you ever need help," he said, "you call this number, that's my chambers, someone will answer." He handed the card to Ida Mee, who took it with trembling fingers. Then he turned and walked back to his car. The motorcade pulled away, and just like that, he was gone. Ida Mee stood frozen on the corner, holding a business card that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Marcus looked up at her. "Grandma, who was that man?" Ida Mee didn't answer right away. She was thinking about all the times she had prayed for someone to notice them, to see their struggle, to offer help. And now that it had happened, she didn't know whether to feel hope or terror, because help from powerful people always came with a cost. She just didn't know what that cost would be yet. 3 days later, Ida Mee's phone rang. She didn't have a cell phone, just an old landline that she kept because it was cheaper and because she couldn't afford to replace it. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Olivia Kendrick, a pro bono family law attorney who worked with a legal aid clinic downtown. "Judge Harlan contacted us," she said. "He told us about your situation. We'd like to help you file for guardianship. There would be no charge." Ida Mee sat down heavily in her kitchen chair. She looked at the business card she had placed on her small kitchen table, next to a stack of bills she couldn't pay. "Why?" she asked. "Why would a federal judge do this for someone like me?" Olivia paused. "Because Judge Harlan grew up being raised by his grandmother too, in a housing project in Detroit. She sold vegetables from a cart to keep him fed. He told me he saw her in your face, and he told me something else. He said that the legal system he serves has failed people like his grandmother for generations, and he refuses to let it fail one more." Ida Mee felt something crack open inside her chest. Not hope, not yet. Something more fragile than hope. The possibility that she might not have to fight alone anymore. But here's where the story takes a turn you won't see coming. Because while Olivia Kendrick was working to help Ida Mee secure legal guardianship, another force was moving in the opposite direction. A social worker named Cynthia Vance had received an anonymous complaint about a child living illegally with a non-custodial relative on the South Side. The complaint was specific. It named Ida Mee Collins. It named Marcus. It alleged educational neglect, illegal housing, and unauthorized care of a minor. Cynthia had a caseload of 47 children, and she was required by law to investigate every single complaint. So on the morning of October 21st, 1 week after the judge's motorcade stopped at the bread corner, Cynthia Vance appeared at Ida Mee's apartment door with a clipboard and the power of the state behind her. Ida Mee opened the door and felt the floor drop out from under her. She had seen this before in her neighborhood. Social workers arriving unannounced. children being taken away. Families shattered by a system that confused poverty with neglect and survival with criminality. Cynthia was professional, polite, and absolutely terrifying. She asked to see the apartment. She asked to see Marcus. She asked about sleeping arrangements, food, medical care, school enrollment. She took notes on a tablet while Ida Mee answered each question with her heart hammering in her chest. Marcus was in the small bedroom doing homework. He didn't know the woman in the living room was there to decide whether he could stay with the only family he had ever known. Cynthia finished her inspection, thanked Ida Mee for her cooperation, and said the words that every kinship caregiver dreads. "We'll be in touch. There may need to be a hearing." The door closed. Ida Mee stood in her living room and felt the walls closing in. She had survived 9 years on a street corner selling bread. She had survived poverty, cold, hunger, and invisibility. But this was different. This was the system that was supposed to protect children threatening to take us away. She picked up the phone and called the number on the card. Judge Harlan took the call personally. That alone was unusual. Federal judges do not take calls from street vendors, but Reginald Harlan was not a typical federal judge, and he had been waiting for this call. He listened as Ida Mee told him about Cynthia Vance, about the complaint, about the hearing that might tear her family apart. When she finished, he said something that changed the course of everything that followed. "Mrs. Collins, the complaint came from inside the system. Someone knew your name, knew your address, knew your grandson's name. That information doesn't end up in a social worker's file by accident. Someone wanted you to be found." Ida Mee felt cold spread through her body. Who? Who would do that? "That's what I intend to find out," Judge Harlan said. "But first we need to make sure Marcus stays with you. Olivia will file an emergency guardianship petition tomorrow morning. I can't hear the case myself. That would be improper. But I know a family court judge who will give you a fair hearing. Her name is Judge Miriam Estrada. She's fair, she's thorough, and she doesn't tolerate the system punishing people for being poor. We have one chance to get this right." And that is when the story became bigger than one grandmother and one boy. Because Judge Harlan's investigation into who filed that anonymous complaint would uncover something rotten. Something that connected Ida Mee's corner to a web of predatory developers, corrupt housing officials, and a scheme to clear low-income residents off valuable South Side real estate. The complaint wasn't about Marcus's welfare. It was about land. It was about displacement. And Ida Mee Collins, a 71-year-old grandmother selling bread on a street corner, was standing directly in the way of people with a great deal of money and no conscience at all. Judge Harlan was not a criminal investigator. He was a federal district judge who spent his days ruling on motions, reading briefs, and occasionally delivering verdicts that changed lives. But what he had learned in 4 decades of practicing and interpreting the law was how to follow a paper trail. And so, in the days after Ida Mee Collins called him, he began pulling on threads. What unraveled was something far darker than a single anonymous complaint. The complaint itself had been submitted through the Department of Children and Family Services hotline. It named Ida Mee Collins, listed her address on East 64th Street, and provided remarkably detailed information about Marcus's school enrollment status, the layout of the apartment, and even the hours Ida Mee operated her bread table. Too detailed for a random neighbor, too targeted for a well-meaning busybody. Judge Harlan had Olivia Kendrick file a Freedom of Information Act request for the complaint's metadata. The hotline call had been placed from a prepaid cell phone, purchased just 3 days before the complaint was filed, activated, and then never used again. That alone was suspicious. Honest people do not buy burner phones to report child neglect. But the real breakthrough came when Judge Harlan cross-referenced the address of the building where Ida Mee lived against a list of properties recently acquired by a development consortium called South Shore Renewal Partners. Ida Mee's building was one of only 3 remaining holdouts on a block that the consortium had been quietly buying up for 18 months. The other 2 buildings were owned by elderly residents who, like Ida Mee, had refused generous buyout offers because they had nowhere else to go. The consortium wanted to build luxury condominiums on that land. The location was prime, just blocks from the planned Obama Presidential Center, a project that was already driving property values upward in surrounding neighborhoods. Ida Mee Collins, 71 years old, a woman who sold bread for $5 a loaf, was standing on land worth millions, and someone wanted her gone. Judge Harlan dug deeper. He found that South Shore Renewal Partners had a consulting arrangement with a former DCFS administrator named Terence Boyle. Boyle had been forced out of the agency 4 years earlier amid allegations of case fixing, soliciting bribes from private foster care agencies, but he had avoided criminal charges because a key witness had suddenly recanted. Now Boyle worked as a community liaison for the Development Consortium, and his job, according to internal memos that Olivia Kendrick obtained through a whistleblower, was to resolve occupancy issues in target buildings. The phrase was chillingly vague. It meant forcing tenants out, and one of the methods the consortium had used in 2 previous cases was to flag vulnerable households to DCFS, triggering investigations that destabilized families and made it easier to justify eviction proceedings. The complaint against Ida Mee was not an isolated incident. It was a tactic. Ida Mee learned all this from Olivia in the cramped living room of her apartment, while Marcus did homework in the next room. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, the same hands that had kneaded dough in the cold before sunrise for 9 years. "So they filed that complaint," she said slowly, "to take Marcus away so they could take my home?" Olivia nodded. "That's what we believe, and if it worked, they'd have you out in weeks. You'd have to leave voluntarily to get your grandson back. They know how the system works. They know grandparents like you have no legal standing. They were counting on you being invisible." Ida Mee's jaw tightened. She had been invisible her entire life, but this was no longer just about survival. This was about justice. The emergency guardianship hearing was set for November 4th, a date that loomed like a guillotine. Judge Miriam Estrada was assigned to the case, a family court judge with a reputation for fairness, but also for strict adherence to procedure. Olivia Kendrick prepared the petition meticulously. She gathered school records, medical records, character affidavits from Ida Mee's customers, testimony from the sympathetic school secretary who had bent the rules, and a sworn statement from Judge Harlan himself describing his observations on that October morning. It was a strong case, but strong cases have been lost before because the law is not always on the side of the poor. The state's attorney assigned to the case was a young lawyer named Derek Simmons. He was overworked, underpaid, and had a caseload of more than 60 active matters, but his supervisor had flagged Ida Mee's case for special attention, unusual for a routine guardianship petition. Olivia discovered through a paralegal contact that the supervisor had received a phone call from Terence Boyle's office 2 days before the hearing. Nothing incriminating was said openly, just a heads up about a potential media interest in child welfare cases in the area. But the implication was clear. Pressure was being applied. The system was tilting. Then, 3 days before the hearing, Ida Mee received an eviction notice. The building's new owner, a shell company linked to South Shore Renewal Partners, cited code violations that had never been flagged before, insufficient window locks, a broken fire escape latch that the previous landlord had ignored for years, an electrical outlet that wasn't grounded. The notice gave her 14 days to vacate. 14 days. The hearing was in 3 days. If she fought the eviction, she would be dragged into housing court simultaneously, splitting her attention and her resources. If she lost the guardianship, she would have no reason to stay anyway. The trap was perfect. Ida Mee stood in her kitchen, the eviction notice trembling in her hand, and for the first time in 9 years, she felt something break. Not her spirit, not her will, but the wall she had built around her fear. She began to cry. Not the quiet, private tears she shed after Marcus went to sleep, but the kind of weeping that comes from a place so deep it feels like it might hollow you out. Marcus came out of his room, saw her standing there, and wrapped his thin arms around her waist. "Don't cry, Grandma," he said. "We still have the bread." That single sentence, spoken with the innocent certainty of a 9-year-old who believed food could solve any problem, reminded Ida Mee of something her own grandmother had said 100 years ago in Mississippi. When you have nothing, you give what you have, and what you give comes back. The next morning, Ida Mee set up her bread table as usual, but she also brought a cardboard sign she had written the night before. It said, "Help save our family." Marcus stood beside her holding his school books. Customers stopped. A local news crew, tipped off by Olivia Kendrick, arrived with cameras. The story of the grandmother who sold bread for 9 years to feed her orphaned grandson, now facing eviction and a state hearing to take him away, began to spread across Chicago. And then, in a twist no one saw coming, an investigative reporter named Camilla Reyes found the connection between the DCFS complaint and South Shore Renewal Partners. She dug up Terence Boyle's history, the burner phone records, the pattern of complaints filed against holdout tenants. She ran the story the night before the guardianship hearing under the headline, "The Cost of Land: How Developers Use the Child Welfare System to Push Out Poor Families." When Judge Miriam Estrada walked into her courtroom on the morning of November 4th, she had already seen the news. She had also received a letter, hand-delivered to her chambers that morning, containing documents that traced the complaint against Ida Mee Collins directly back to a consulting fee paid to Terence Boyle's shell company, authorized by the Chief Operating Officer of South Shore Renewal Partners. The documents had no return address, no cover note, but the paper trail was undeniable. Someone on the inside had flipped. And the courtroom, packed with supporters and reporters, waited in silence for the gavel to fall. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Estrada looked down at the documents that had arrived on her desk that morning, the ones tracing the complaint against Ida Mee Collins directly to the Development Consortium. She removed her glasses, set them aside, and addressed the packed room. "As an officer of this court, I have sworn to uphold the law without regard to wealth, race, or circumstance. But the law must also be administered with a clear understanding of the difference between justice and procedure." She paused. "Today, this court is not merely ruling on a guardianship petition. It is ruling on whether a grandmother who has spent 9 years feeding her grandson by selling bread on a street corner should lose that child because a corporation wants her land." Derek Simmons, the state's attorney, stood up. "Your Honor, the state's interest is solely the welfare of the child. We have no objection to the petition." His voice was quiet, but carried across the room. He had read the documents too. Judge Estrada continued, "The evidence before me demonstrates that the complaint against Mrs. Collins was manufactured. It was filed in bad faith by individuals seeking to leverage the child welfare system for financial gain. This is an abuse of the system that this court finds deeply disturbing." She turned to face Ida Mee directly. "Mrs. Collins, you have done everything right with almost nothing. You have fed, clothed, educated, and loved this child for 9 years without any legal recognition, without any government support, and in constant fear that the state would take him from you. That ends today." She signed the order. "I am granting full legal guardianship of Marcus Collins to Ida Mee Collins, effective immediately." The room erupted. Not the polite applause of a courtroom, but something raw, something that came from the gut. Ida Mee covered her face with both hands and wept. Marcus, sitting beside her in a button-down shirt Olivia had brought him, looked up at his grandmother and then at the judge. "Does this mean I can stay with Grandma?" he asked, his voice small but steady. Judge Estrada leaned forward. "It means she is your legal guardian now, young man. No one can take you away from her, not ever again." Marcus turned and buried his face in Ida Mee's shoulder. She held him the way she had held him since he was 6 weeks old, tight, certain, like nothing in the world could break that grip. But the judge was not finished. She addressed the courtroom again. "This court is referring the matter of the fraudulent DCFS complaint to the state's attorney for criminal investigation. Falsifying a child welfare report is a felony in Illinois. Using the foster care system as a tool for real estate displacement is not just unethical, it is illegal. And if the evidence supports it, those responsible will be prosecuted." Within a week, the Illinois Attorney General's office launched an investigation into South Shore Renewal Partners. Terence Boyle, the former DCFS administrator turned consultant, was arrested on charges of felony conspiracy and filing false reports. The COO who had authorized the payment to Boyle's shell company resigned the same day the story broke. The Development Consortium dropped its eviction proceedings against all 3 holdout tenants on East 64th Street. Within a month, the entire project was suspended pending a full audit, and Judge Reginald Harlan, the man whose motorcade had stopped on that October morning, made good on a deeper promise. He established a pro bono legal clinic for kinship caregivers, connecting grandmothers and aunts and older siblings raising children without legal standing to attorneys who could help them secure the paperwork that would protect their families. He called it the Collins Initiative. He never told Ida Mee he was naming it after her. She found out when Olivia mentioned it months later, and she sat in her kitchen, now with legal guardianship papers framed on the wall, and cried again. But here is the surprising detail that most people don't know. The whistleblower who sent those documents to Judge Estrada's chambers on the morning of the hearing, the one who provided the paper trail connecting the complaint to the development company, was Cynthia Vance, the same social worker who had shown up at Ida Mee's door with a clipboard and the power of the state. She had been assigned to investigate the complaint, but when she dug into the file, she saw the pattern. She saw what was being done. And she chose to risk her career to stop it. After the case, she transferred to a unit that specialized in kinship care support, helping families like Ida Mees navigate the system instead of being crushed by it. As for Ida Mee, she still sells bread, not because she has to anymore. The Collins Initiative helped her secure survivor benefits and a small grant that kept her afloat, but because she wants to. The corner of 63rd and Cottage Grove is a landmark now. People come from across the city to buy a loaf of that bread, the recipe passed down from an enslaved ancestor in Mississippi, the bread that fed a boy and built a movement. And Marcus, he's in high school now, on a roll, wants to be a lawyer. He keeps a photo on his phone of the day Judge Estrada signed the order, and in it, he's holding a loaf of bread and smiling. The system had tried to make them invisible. But once you have been seen by someone with the power to change things, invisibility is no longer a fate. It is a choice, and Ida Mee Collins chose to be seen for the rest of her life. Here is the truth that Ida Mee Collins learned the hard way. There are more than 2.5 million grandparents raising grandchildren in America right now. Nearly 1 in 5 of them lives below the poverty line. Most have no legal standing, no custody papers. No guarantee that the child they have raised since birth won't be taken tomorrow by a system that confuses paperwork with love. They are invisible until something goes wrong. What happened on 63rd and Cottage Grove was not just one grandmother's victory. It was a crack in a wall that has stood for generations. A wall built on the assumption that poor people cannot be trusted to raise their own children. A wall maintained by bureaucracies that see a folding table and a bread sign and somehow miss the 9 years of sacrifice and survival standing right behind it. Judge Harlan stopped his motorcade for a boy doing homework on a milk crate. But the real question is this: how many other grandmothers are still standing on corners waiting for someone to stop? If this story moved you, share it. Because somewhere in your city, on a street you drive past every day, there is an Ida Mee Collins. Someone whose existence is the only thing holding a family together, whose hands are cracked from work you will never see, and whose name the system does not know. Share this video to make one more person see. And subscribe now so you never miss another story about the people hidden in plain sight.